You learned to make yourself smaller. Not physically, though maybe that too, the way you'd shrink your shoulders when you walked into a room, or fold your arms tight across your body like you were trying to contain something. But mostly you learned to make yourself smaller in the ways that don't show up in photographs. Quieter, less demanding, less visible. You learned to take up just enough space to exist, but not so much space that anyone would notice you were there. This video is for you if you spent your childhood learning how to disappear without leaving. If that sentence feels familiar, if something in you recognized it before you had time to think about it, then you already know what we're talking about here. You know what it feels like to be the child in the room who didn't cause problems. The one adults called easy. The one who learned early that the way to be safe, the way to be loved, the way to keep the peace was to need less. Ask for less. Be less. And here's what nobody tells you about that particular survival strategy. It works. It really does work for a long time. You become good at it. So good that it stops feeling like a strategy at all and starts feeling like who you are. You stop thinking I'm making myself small and you start thinking I guess I'm just not the kind of person who needs much. But underneath that story, underneath the carefully constructed identity of someone who is low maintenance, self-sufficient, unbothered, there is a question that has been quietly shaping your life without you fully realizing it. And the question is this: if I take up more space than this, will I still be wanted? We're going to spend some time with that question. Not to answer it the way you might hope. Not to give you permission, as if permission from the outside could finally undo what was learned on the inside. But to understand where it came from. To see with clear eyes what you were actually responding to when you learned to make yourself small. Because before anything can change, you have to know what you're changing from. You probably can't point to a single moment when it happened. That's one of the confusing things about this. There's rarely a scene you can replay in your mind where someone sat you down and told you explicitly, take up less space. It wasn't a rule that was spoken out loud. It was more like an atmosphere, a feeling that accumulated over thousands of small interactions, small adjustments, small moments of learning what happened when you were too loud, too needy, too much. Maybe it was the way a parent's face changed when you interrupted them. Not anger necessarily, just a kind of tiredness, a heaviness. A look that said, I can't hold this right now without having to say anything at all. And you, being a child, being entirely dependent on that parent's emotional availability, learned to read that look faster than you learned to read words on a page. You learned that when that look appeared, your job was to retreat, to become smaller, to stop needing whatever it was you thought you needed. Or maybe it was subtler than that. Maybe it was the way your enthusiasm was met with silence. The way your stories trailed off because no one was really listening. The way you'd walk into a room with something to say and realize by the quality of the air in that room that this was not the time. That your presence, your energy, your simple desire to be seen and engaged with, that these things were somehow inconvenient. Not always. Not in every moment, but often enough that you started to internalize a particular message, that the world is a more peaceful place when you are not fully in it. This is what taking up space meant to you as a child. It meant being loud when quiet was expected. It meant needing attention when attention was already stretched thin. It meant having feelings that were too big or too complicated or too inconvenient for the adults around you to hold. It meant, in 1,000 unnamed ways, being more than the environment around you had room for. And because children are not capable of concluding that the environment is the problem, because a child's survival depends on believing that the people taking care of them are fundamentally safe and good, you concluded instead that you were the problem. That the issue was not that the space was too small, but that you were too large. That you needed to adjust, to compress, to learn how to fit into the shape that was available, even if that shape didn't actually have room for all of who you were. So you did what children do when they need to survive in an environment that doesn't quite fit them. You adapted. You became observant. You learned to read the room, to track moods, to sense when it was safe to be yourself and when it was safer to be less. You became the kind of child who didn't ask for much, who entertained themselves, who solved their own problems, who learned, in all the quiet ways a child learns, that love might be more reliable if you required less of it. Have you noticed that you still do this? That even now, as an adult, in rooms where there is no evidence that your presence is unwelcome, you find yourself monitoring, measuring, trying to take up just enough space to be included, but not so much space that you become a burden. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from a time when it was necessary, when shrinking yourself was not a personality flaw but a survival skill. When the child you were looked around at the world they had been born into and made a perfectly rational decision. If I can't make the space bigger, I will make myself smaller. You weren't born knowing how to do this. You learned it. And you learned it because, at some point, being small felt safer than being seen. To understand why this happened, you have to understand something about how a child's mind works. A child does not experience their parents objectively. A child does not look at a tired, overwhelmed, emotionally distant parent and think, "This person is struggling with something that has nothing to do with me." A child's entire reality is organized around one central question. Am I safe here? And the answer to that question doesn't come from logic or reasoning. It comes from the felt sense of whether the people around them are emotionally available, consistently present, genuinely glad to see them. When that felt sense is unreliable, when a parent is sometimes warm and sometimes withdrawn, sometimes present and sometimes somewhere else entirely even though they're standing right in front of you, the child doesn't conclude that the parent is inconsistent. The child concludes that they themselves must be doing something wrong. That sometimes they are the kind of child who is easy to love, and sometimes they are the kind of child who is too much. And if they can just figure out which behaviors make them lovable and which behaviors make them inconvenient, then they can control the outcome. They can keep themselves safe. This is not a conscious process. No child sits down and thinks through this logic step by step. But the nervous system is always tracking patterns, always asking, what happens when I am loud? What happens when I need something? What happens when I express a feeling that is inconvenient or uncomfortable for the person I depend on? And if the answer to those questions is withdrawal or irritation, or a kind of emotional absence that feels like abandonment even when the person hasn't physically left the room, then the child learns. They learn that certain parts of themselves are acceptable and certain parts are not. And the parts that are not acceptable get compressed, hidden, tucked away into the internal space where things go when they're not safe to show. You weren't taught this explicitly. You absorbed it. The way children absorb everything through repetition, through the accumulation of moments that all pointed in the same direction. Maybe your parent was dealing with their own pain. Maybe they were depressed or anxious, or carrying an unresolved grief that left them emotionally unavailable even when they were physically present. Maybe they were in a difficult marriage or under financial stress, or simply never taught how to hold space for a child's big, messy, inconvenient emotions because no one had ever held space for theirs. None of this makes you less affected by it. The reason something happened does not change the fact that it happened. And what happened is that you, as a child, needed more presence than you received. More spaciousness. More room to be fully yourself without having to monitor whether that fullness was welcome. And so you did what all children do when the environment cannot expand to meet them. You contracted. You made yourself fit. You learned which version of yourself was easiest for the people around you to tolerate, and you became that version as often as you could. Not because you were manipulative or inauthentic or inherently self-denying, but because the alternative, being fully yourself and risking rejection or withdrawal, or the particular kind of aloneness that happens when someone is right there but emotionally unreachable, felt more dangerous than the slow disappearance of the parts of you that didn't fit. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from this. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being with people but not being truly seen by them, of editing yourself so thoroughly that even when you're included, even when you're part of the conversation, part of the family, part of the room, there is a quiet awareness that the version of you that is present is not the whole version, that you are performing a kind of acceptability, and the performance is so seamless that no one realizes there's anything underneath it. Did you ever feel, as a child, like you had to be two different people? The person you were in your own head, the one with big feelings, big needs, big wants, and the person you were allowed to be out loud, which was smaller, quieter, easier. That split didn't happen because something was wrong with you. It happened because you were trying to solve an impossible problem. You needed to be yourself because being yourself is a fundamental human need. And you needed to stay connected to the people you depended on, because connection is also a fundamental need. But the environment you were in didn't have room for both. So you found a way to split the difference, to keep the parts of yourself that were acceptable visible, and to hide the parts that were not. This is what developmental psychologists sometimes call a false self. Not false in the sense of dishonest, but false in the sense of constructed. A version of you that was built to meet the demands of an environment that could not hold all of you. And the tragedy of the false self is not that it exists. Most of us develop some version of it, because most environments require some degree of adaptation. The tragedy is when the false self becomes so dominant, so automatic, so thoroughly integrated into your identity, that you forget there was ever a true self underneath it. You forget that you once had needs that went unexpressed, feelings that went unwitnessed, desires that seemed too large or too inconvenient to bring into the light. You forget because forgetting is easier than grieving. And grieving is what you would have to do if you let yourself remember that you once wanted to take up more space than you were allowed, and that something in you had to shrink to survive. The child you were made a trade, safety for authenticity, connection for wholeness, and at the time it was the right trade. It was the only trade available. But trades that are made in childhood don't automatically expire when childhood ends. They linger. They become the unspoken rules by which you continue to live long after the circumstances that required them have changed. You are not in that house anymore. You are not dependent on those people anymore. The world you live in now is not the world that taught you to be small. But the part of you that learned to be small is still operating as though it is, still monitoring, still measuring, still asking in every interaction, every relationship, every room you walk into, how much of me is safe to show here? That question was once a tool for survival. But survival tools, when they outlast the danger that required them, can become chains. And you have been carrying those chains for a very long time, so long that you might not even feel their weight anymore. You might just think this is who you are. Person who doesn't need much. Person who is easy. A person who has learned to make peace with taking up less space than they actually require. But you weren't born this way. You adapted this way. And anything that was adapted can, with time and intention and a kind of patient self-compassion, be unadapted. Here is what it looks like now in your adult life. You might notice that you apologize reflexively, not just when you've done something wrong, but as a kind of preemptive softening. Sorry, can I just? Sorry, do you have a second? Sorry to bother you. As if your presence itself requires an apology. As if simply existing in someone's vicinity, needing something, asking for something, is an imposition that must be acknowledged and minimized before it can be permitted. You might notice that you have a hard time stating preferences. When someone asks what you want, where to eat, what movie to watch, how you'd like to spend an evening, there's a moment of blankness. Not because you don't have preferences, but because the question itself feels almost dangerous. What if your preference is inconvenient? What if it requires someone else to adjust, to compromise, to go out of their way? It feels safer to defer, to say I'm fine with whatever and mean it, because meaning it protects you from the possibility of being too much. You might notice that you're deeply uncomfortable with attention. Not the kind of attention that comes from being useful or helpful, that kind you can tolerate because it has a clear purpose, a clear justification. But attention that is simply about you, about who you are, about your thoughts or feelings or experiences, that kind of attention can feel exposing. Overwhelming, like being seen under a light that's too bright. You find yourself deflecting compliments, changing the subject when the focus turns to you, redirecting conversations back to other people because that's where you're most comfortable. In the audience, not on the stage. You give a lot. You are probably known among the people who know you as someone who shows up, who listens, who remembers, who offers help before it's asked for. And this is not a performance. You genuinely care, you genuinely want to be there for people. But there is also something underneath the generosity that is less about pure kindness and more about a deeply ingrained belief that your value is tied to your usefulness. That love, or friendship, or belonging is something you earn by being helpful, by being low maintenance, by making other people's lives easier, not by simply being yourself. Have you noticed that it's easier for you to give than to receive? That when someone offers you help or care or their time, something in you wants to minimize it, to insist that you're fine, that you don't need much, that they really don't have to go out of their way. This is not humility. This is the old belief still running quietly in the background. That needing something from someone else makes you a burden. That taking up their time, their energy, their emotional space is an imposition. That you should be able to manage on your own, and if you can't, then at the very least you should make it as easy as possible for them to help you. Quick, efficient, grateful, over before they have time to resent it. You might also notice that you're hyper-aware of other people's emotions. You can walk into a room and immediately sense the mood. You can tell, within seconds, whether someone is upset, or withdrawn, or uncomfortable, even if they haven't said a word. This is not a small skill, it's a kind of emotional literacy that many people never develop. But it didn't come from a place of natural curiosity. Came from necessity. You learned to read people because knowing what they were feeling gave you information about how you needed to be. whether it was safe to be yourself or whether you needed to adjust, to accommodate, to become smaller so that their discomfort didn't become your problem. And here's the cost of that. You spent so much of your life attuned to other people's inner worlds that you became less attuned to your own. You can tell with remarkable accuracy what someone else needs or wants or is feeling. But when someone asks you the same question, what do you need? What do you want? How are you feeling? The answer doesn't come easily. Not because you're emotionally stunted or disconnected, but because the muscle of self-attention was never fully developed. You were too busy attending outward to practice attending inward. So you have become someone who can hold space for others but struggles to claim space for yourself. Someone who is endlessly patient with other people's needs but quietly impatient with your own. Someone who knows intellectually that you deserve care and attention and room to exist fully, but who, in practice, continues to make yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding, because that is the pattern that was etched into you before you had the language to question it. The cost of this shows up in your relationships, though not always in obvious ways. You tend to be drawn to people who need a lot from you, not because you're consciously seeking that dynamic, but because being needed feels like a form of security. When someone needs you, you know where you stand. You know what your role is. You know that you have value because your value is measurable in the help you provide, the support you offer, the ways you make their life easier or better or more manageable. But when someone simply wants you, when they aren't asking for anything in particular, aren't leaning on you in any specific way, but just enjoy your presence and want to be near you, that can feel harder to trust. Because wanting without needing doesn't have a clear transaction. It doesn't have a measurable exchange. And if you can't measure it, you can't be sure it's real. So you find yourself sometimes staying in relationships where you give far more than you receive. Not because the other person is necessarily taking advantage of you, though sometimes they are, but because the imbalance feels familiar. It feels like the shape that love is supposed to take. You give, they receive, and as long as that dynamic holds, you feel secure in your place within it. But the moment the balance shifts, the moment you need something or you ask for something, or you're simply not as available as you usually are, there's a quiet panic that sets in. A fear that if you're not constantly giving, constantly useful, constantly accommodating, the person will realize that you're not actually worth the effort. This fear is not logical. You probably know that. You probably have relationships in your life where there is no evidence that this is true. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your body are two different things. And what your body knows, what it learned long before your rational mind could question it, is that love is conditional, that it has to be earned, that the moment you stop earning it, it will disappear. There is also a cost in the way you relate to your own ambitions, your own desires, your own right to take up space in the world in a visible way. You might find that you struggle with self-promotion, with putting yourself forward, with claiming recognition for your work or your accomplishments. Not because you lack confidence in your abilities, you might be very good at what you do, but because being visible, being recognized, taking credit, feels like a form of taking up space that you're still not entirely sure you're allowed to occupy. Can feel presumptuous, self-important, like you're asking for more attention than you deserve. So you stay small even when staying small is no longer necessary. You downplay your achievements. You deflect praise. You let other people take credit because it feels safer to be in the background than to step into the light and risk being judged as someone who wants too much, asks for too much, takes up too much room. Did you ever notice that other people seem to move through the world with a kind of ease that you don't have? That they seem to assume, without questioning it, that they belong in the spaces they occupy, that their needs are legitimate, their desires are valid, their presence is welcome, that ease is not something they were born with, it's something they learned. They learned it the same way you learned the opposite, through repetition, through accumulation, through thousands of small moments that all sent the same message. The difference is their message was, you are allowed to be here. You are allowed to want things. You are allowed to take up space. And your message was, you are allowed to be here if you're not too much trouble. And so you have spent your life being not too much trouble, being accommodating, being flexible, being someone who doesn't make waves, doesn't demand attention, doesn't require anyone to go out of their way. And in some ways, this has served you. It has kept you safe. It has kept you connected, even if the connection sometimes feels more like proximity than true intimacy. But it has also cost you something enormous. It has cost you the felt experience of being fully yourself in the presence of other people, of expressing a need without fear, of wanting something without shame, of existing in a room without constantly monitoring whether your existence is welcome. You are tired, not just physically, though maybe that too, but tired in the deeper way that comes from spending years holding yourself in a shape that doesn't quite fit. Tired of being so careful. Tired of making yourself smaller. Tired of the internal calculation that happens every time you're about to speak or ask for something or express a preference. The calculation that runs in the background asking, is this too much? Will this be a problem? Should I just let it go? That calculation is not a personality trait. It's not just who you are. It's a remnant of something you learned a long time ago in a context that no longer exists. And it has been running on autopilot for so long that it might feel like it's simply part of your nature. But it's not. It's a pattern. And patterns, when you can see them clearly enough, can be interrupted. Not erased. Not undone in a single moment of insight, but interrupted, questioned, gently, carefully, with a kind of compassion for the child who learned this pattern in the first place, brought into the light and examined for what it actually is. A survival strategy that once kept you safe and that now, in a different context, is keeping you small. Not because there's nothing to be done, but because the language of fixing implies that something is broken. And you are not broken. You are carrying something that made sense once in a context that required it, and that context has changed but the carrying hasn't. That's not a defect. That's just what happens when survival strategies outlive the circumstances that created them. What matters more than fixing is understanding. Understanding what actually happened. Not the sanitized version where you tell yourself it wasn't that bad, or that other people had it worse, or that you turned out fine so it must not have mattered. The real version. The one where a child needed space to be fully themselves, and that space wasn't consistently available, and the child adapted by learning to need less space. By learning to compress themselves into whatever shape the environment could hold. That happened. It was real. And it shaped you in ways that were entirely logical given what you were working with. Here's something that might be worth sitting with. The strategies you developed were not failures. They were intelligence. The self-monitoring, the accommodating, the reflexive smallness. None of these arose because you were weak or broken or fundamentally flawed. They arose because you were a child trying to stay safe and connected in an environment that couldn't consistently hold all of you. And you found ways to do it. Remarkably effective ways. You learned to read people with extraordinary accuracy. You learned to adapt, to be flexible, to manage your own needs so that other people didn't have to. These were feats of survival. acts of creativity under constraint. The problem is not that you develop them. The problem is that they are still running, long after the danger has passed. You are not a child anymore. You are not in that environment anymore. The people in your life now are not the people who taught you that taking up space was dangerous. And yet the part of you that learned that lesson is still operating as though the lesson is current. Still shrinking, still monitoring, still asking in every interaction, how much of me is safe to show here? That question made sense once, kept you safe. But it is no longer the question you need to be asking. The question you need now is different. It's quieter, harder to answer, but it's the one that actually matters. What would it feel like to stop shrinking? Not to suddenly take up all the space in the room. Not to become loud, or demanding, or inconsiderate. But to simply stop the reflexive contraction. To let yourself exist at your actual size, without the constant internal negotiation about whether that size is acceptable. To express a need without immediately apologizing for it. To state a preference without scanning the room first to see if it's safe. To take up the space that your full, unedited presence actually requires, and to trust, not all at once, but gradually in small experiments in low-stakes moments, that the world will not punish you for it. This is not a reframe that tells you everything was fine, or that you should be grateful for what you learned, or that your smallness was actually a gift in disguise. It wasn't. It was a cost, a real one, and you are allowed to grieve it. To grieve the years you spent compressing yourself. To grieve the version of you that might have existed if you had been allowed to be full-sized from the beginning. To grieve the childhood that would have let you take up space without fear. That grief is not indulgent. It's not self-pitying. It's accurate. It's the appropriate response to a real loss. And it deserves to be felt, quietly and honestly, without anyone telling you to move on from it faster than you're ready to. But alongside the grief, there is also this, you are still here. You adapted, and the adaptation kept you alive, kept you connected, carried you through to the other side of a childhood that didn't have room for all of you. And now you are standing in a life that is yours. A life where the rules are no longer the same. Where the people around you are not the people who taught you to be small. Where the possibility exists not easily, not without effort, but genuinely to begin learning a different way. You were not born knowing how to shrink. You learned it, and anything that was learned can, with time and patience and a kind of fierce, protective tenderness toward the child who did the learning, be slowly unlearned. Not by forcing yourself to be different, not by scolding yourself for still being small, but by noticing with curiosity rather than judgment the moments when the old pattern activates. By asking yourself in those moments, is this actually necessary right now? Or is this just the old reflex, running on autopilot, trying to keep me safe from a danger that no longer exists? And then, when you're ready, by experimenting, by taking one small risk, by saying one thing you would normally keep to yourself, by asking for one thing you would normally go without, by staying in the room when your instinct is to leave, or speaking up when your instinct is to stay quiet, and noticing, really noticing what actually happens. Not what you fear will happen, but what actually does. Most of the time, you will find that the thing you were afraid of doesn't occur. That the person doesn't withdraw or get annoyed or make you feel like a burden. That taking up slightly more space than you usually allow yourself doesn't result in rejection. It results in connection, in being seen, in the quiet relief of not having to perform smallness for one more interaction. And slowly, through the accumulation of those moments, the old belief begins to loosen. Not all at once, not in a dramatic revelation, but gradually, steadily, in the same way it was built, through repetition, through lived experience, through the quiet recognition that the world you are living in now is not the world that taught you to disappear. Not conditionally. Not if you've been good enough, useful enough, accommodating enough. Not if you've earned it through years of being low maintenance. Just allowed. Because you are a person and people take up space, and that is not a design flaw. It's not something that needs to be justified. It's simply what it means to exist. The child who learned to be small was doing something necessary. They were protecting themselves in the only way they knew how. They were navigating an environment that couldn't hold all of them, and they found a way to fit. That child deserves your compassion, not your frustration, not your impatience with yourself for still carrying this pattern. Compassion, the kind that recognizes that what they did was remarkable, and that it worked, and that it's okay to let it go now. You don't have to keep being small to stay safe. The people who taught you to shrink are not the people in your life now. The environment that required it has changed. And while the old pattern still runs, still whispers in your ear that you're too much, that you should apologize, that you should make yourself smaller before someone else does it for you, that pattern is not the truth. It's an echo, a remnant, a voice from a past that no longer defines your present. The question we started with, if I take up more space than this, will I still be wanted, is not a question that can be answered through reassurance. Not really, because the fear underneath it is too old, too deep, too woven into the fabric of how you learn to be in the world. The only way to answer it is to live it, to take up space incrementally, carefully, in small moments and then slightly larger ones, and to notice what actually happens. To gather evidence not from what you were told as a child, but from what you experience as an adult. And what you will find, if you pay attention, is that most people do not experience your fullness as a burden. They experience it as a gift, as the thing they were waiting for, as the version of you that feels real and present, and finally here in a way that the small version never quite was. You were not too much. You were in an environment that was too small, and you are not in that environment anymore. It is okay to stop shrinking now. It is okay to let yourself be seen. It is okay to need things and want things and express things, and take up the space that your full, unedited, unapologetically present self actually requires. Not because someone gave you permission, not because you finally did enough to deserve it, but because you were always allowed. You just didn't know it yet. And now maybe you're beginning to,